In the first video lecture on Marx, we looked at the German ideology. We discussed Marx's historical materialism, his kind of turning of Hegel right side up on his feet, saying, no, look at the material circumstances of a society, and that is how you will understand what progress is and what determines what people think. We saw how Marx is a philosopher of suspicion and that he is skeptical of philosophy as some transcendental enterprise, but instead is the ideas it produces are born within the context of a civilization based on its the development of its mode of production. And then we discussed his concept of positive liberty and why communism is necessary. And it's not only that it's something that ought to come about, he argues, it's something that inevitably will come about just through the processes of history, that it can't be stopped. Now, though, instead of, since last time we looked at the positive aspect of freedom, now I want to look at the ways in which Marx argues people of the working class are not actually free. Because I think many people would see his arguments of positive liberty and freedom and maybe think like, well, I'm not really sure how that applies to me, how I'm not already free and don't seemingly have that. But here we're going to see in what's known as the Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts of 1844, or just simply the Paris manuscripts, as I'll call them, because they're written in Paris then. Here, he wants to explain how the existence of private property in capitalism necessarily renders the working class economically unfree and ultimately alienated and exploited. So, first we'll look at what Marx calls the twofold deprivation of the means to life. The way in which the worker becomes a slave of his object, and why Marxists refer to labor and capitalism as as wage slavery. So, first Marx says, the individual not owning the means of production, because if you work for, let's say, a restaurant, you don't own the building, you don't own the machines which produce the food. If you work at a construction company, of course, you don't own any of the supplies or tools you use or the natural resources. So in all those different cases, the individual worker not owning then the means of production receives means of subsistence and not subsistence itself, because the worker is compensated in wages, but of course must continually go back then to the capitalist to receive those wages. So the worker does not actually have subsistence, but a means to subsistence. Secondly, this individual then must receive work, since they are only given means of subsistence and not subsistence. And that means then the worker is always dependent on the capitalist. Now, of course, Marx would say, though, that it's really the capitalist who is more dependent on the laborer, because at any time they don't have wage laborers, the capitalist becomes a wage laborer. So the individual of the working class or the proletariat, they must receive work. So they must then sell their labor time to a capitalist. And that means three. And here's the interesting conclusion here. The individual laborer then exists as a worker first before a physical subject, before a human being. Marx says, so much does labor's realization appear as loss of reality, that the worker loses reality to the point of starving to death. And what he means by that is the working class, the proletariat, the wage laborers, wage slaves, whatever you want to say about them, they are workers first before human beings, before a physical subject. And the reason is, if they do not receive wages, they do not exist. So they must always, before their humanity, put their work first. And this is the first and I think most totally alienating fact that Marx argues is the situation of the working class. Now, he has four main points, though, that in more detail explain this general alienation of the worker that we just briefly looked at. So let's look at the first one. The first argument is that the worker is alienated, so divorced, separated from, estranged from the product of their labor. That all the things the laborer produces, they are alienated from. So if you're in a factory, whatever you produce in that factory, you're divorced from that object. Here we have then the objectification and the commodification of the worker. That the worker is therefore objectified, and that the worker exists as a commodity, but the product of the laborer's work is the material result of this objectification. Because the worker never has any say over what they are doing every single day, and only exists in an objectified way, as a non-personal relationship. So Marx says, all these consequences are contained in the definition that the worker is related to the product of his labor as to an alien, an object. Now, why? Why is the worker related then to those goods they produce as an alien to an object? And the answer is because the life of the worker is then put into the object, of which the laborer has no control over, and is immediately and always already divorced from their self. That the worker spends hour after hour, day after day, laboring, expending their mental and physical power on objects which are not their own, which are constantly being pushed out from their body into the hands of someone else. Now think of the difference with like an artisan. An artisan makes a product of which they see a reflection of themselves in that product because they expend physical and mental labor power and energy. The laborer, though, in capitalism, Marx is saying, has no object of which they see their reflection. Instead, there's like an empty void where day after day producing these goods, they are gone, they disappear. And therefore, in that way, the worker is made an alien to the very thing which they produce because it's gone, it's foreign to them. Secondly, there is alienation considered in the act of production, or what Marx calls self-estrangement. And this is the way in which the very act, then, of being a wage laborer is a divorcing of yourself from yourself. Now that seems pretty extreme and maybe a foreign concept, to be divorced from yourself. But let's see these three main points that Marx gives to back up this argument here. So this is on page 74. Marx says, what then constitutes the alienation of labor? First, the fact that labor is external to the worker, i.e., it does not belong to his essential being. That in his work, therefore, he does not affirm himself, but denies himself. Does not feel content, but unhappy. Does not develop freely his physical and mental energy, but mortifies his body and ruins his mind. The worker, therefore, only feels himself outside his work, and in his work feels outside himself. He is at home when he is not working, and when he is working, he is not at home. I have to admit that the first time I read this argument from Marx, back in, I think it was 2014, I've worked on and off in the restaurant industry as a server, working in the kitchen, and I could not help but, as reading that argument, think that Marx was speaking to me, because every time I would go in to be a server, right, I felt like I always had to put on this mask, and I didn't want my friends and family really to see me because I had to be someone who I didn't feel like was really me, you know, I was putting on this act. And so this person I would have to become was someone foreign to who I really felt that I really was, such that when I was at work, I was not at home. I did not feel that I was truly being who I thought I was. And it was only when I was at home that I was feeling normal and myself and real, but yet capitalism is trying to say that's not really you because it's not profitable, right? Whatever you want to do in your own free time, only producing profit and the growth of capital is deemed valuable. Now, the second point, the labor of the worker is therefore not voluntary but coerced. It is forced labor. And so this is an argument that then goes against philosophical liberalism, which of course, right, is against coercion, but does not recognize the idea of social coercion. As where Marx here is saying, no, there is social coercion, and liberalism's defense of capitalism proves that it actually undermines its own philosophy because it legitimizes social coercion. So Marx says, it is therefore not the satisfaction of a need. It is merely a means to satisfy needs external to it, which of course are your very life, the subsistence required for you to continue existing. Its alien character emerges clearly in the fact that as soon as no physical or other compulsion exists, labor is shunned like the plague. External labor, labor in which man alienates himself, is a labor of self-sacrifice, of mortification. That the reason labor is therefore coerced is because it is something not actually desired, but seen as a means to some end, of which, if that ability to then perform labor in the form of being compensated then by wages, one dies then, right? They don't actually ever receive those needs external to labor itself, but only receive the labor which then mediates between the needs which are the continued existence of the worker. And finally, the external character of labor for the worker appears in the fact that it is not his own, but someone else's, that it does not belong to him, that in it he belongs not to himself, but to another, and that is as a whole. And this is something about that progression of epochs, right, where you have the ancient, and then you have the feudal, and then capitalism, that in each case, where it's clear that between the slave and the master, right, that this antagonistic relationship, the exploitation of the slave, is clear as day. Then, though, in the case of, in feudalism, the serf, that the serf is exploited is a bit more obfuscated, right? It's not as clear. It's more abstract exploitation because it's not an individual, a master, that the serf is tied to. It's the land. And then, in capitalism, the proletariat, the working class, is not tied to any individual. They're not enslaved to the individual. They're not enslaved to the land because you can go get any other job. Instead, Marx argues, capitalism, and this is why it's been able to survive, it is abstracted exploitation so much that the worker is not tied is not tied to a person or a land, but instead it is the class of the proletariat which is tied to the class of the bourgeoisie. That is where the enslavement is, because the working class cannot exist then without the bourgeoisie. And in that case, there is no self-mastery, but only dependency on that class. Now, what does this all mean? Well, Marx says, as a result, therefore, the worker no longer feels himself to be freely active in any but his animal functions, eating, drinking, procreating, or at most in his dwelling and in dressing up, etc. And in his human functions, he no longer feels himself to be anything but an animal. What is animal becomes human, and what is human becomes animal. That argument, I think, is seen every single day. You may not realize it. But what Marx is saying there is that in what is animal becomes human and what is human becomes animal is that think about most of the time when people are exhausted from working, what is it they want to do when they have their free time? Lay around, consume TV, consume food, go out and drink, things which are physical pleasures. never usually mental pleasures. Why? Because physical labor drains the mind so much that there can then be no devotion to the more noble pursuits of a human being, but instead, as Marx is arguing, the more animal pursuits of just the gratification physically and therefore physical pleasure. Okay, let's look then at the third way in which the working class is alienated. Now, this is a bit more abstract. This is what Marx calls the alienation of species being. So, species being is a being that is considered itself free, as if it is the universal species of which it is a part. So, what is meant is that a species being is, in that humanity is a species being, and that it treats itself as a universal and therefore free being. That humanity, in developing that third stage of consciousness, can't think of itself as humanity, as separate from other things, as being able to universalize its will, right? That it can think not of just itself as an individual, that I am Austin, I am just a thing existing, but instead that I am connected to something larger, to humanity. So what is the problem then in this alienation of species being? Well, Marx says that in estranging from the worker, one, nature, and two, their self, the life of the species turns into a life of the individual. And therefore, estranged or alienated labor estranges the species from humanity. That no longer then do workers become to see themselves as part of the working class or humanity, but instead as individuals competing among other individuals. So much so then that this competition leads Marx to say that therefore life itself appears only as a means to life. And again, he says, in degrading spontaneous activity, free activity to a means, estranged labor makes man's species life a means to his physical existence. That we only therefore develop our intellectual capacities to produce results which bring about greater efficiency and create greater profit, but no longer for the sake of just enjoying the arts or things like that, right? No longer just studying to study, getting an education to get an education, to be a better person. Instead, you only get an education to, in some way, make more money or, increase the value of capital. And in that way, Marx is saying the working class is alienated from what he calls species being. The fourth and final form then of alienation is alienation of person from person. So within the relationship of estranged or alienated labor, each worker encounters and therefore understands the value of the other workers with the standard and position in which they find themselves as a worker. So every worker encounters another worker as a potential competitor, one person who can deny them more wages, or worse, who can take their job. So each person then that the working class comes into contact with is understood either as, one, an active or a potential competitor, or two, a commodity-like being to be used as a means to grow capital, that we come to see our fellow human beings as means to ends, and not as ends in themselves. And in this way, you can see there's an affinity with Kant and what he talks about, and the ideas of liberalism, of treating human beings as ends in themselves. And Marx is saying capitalism denies us from being able to do that. And think about the ways in which, if you go to a party or you socialize, there's this talk about social networking. Are you doing social networking so you can get people's contacts, not because you want to genuinely be their friend, but because of the value they give to you in their knowledge or their connections they have that might improve your prospects as a wage laborer or as moving up some ranks in some white-collar job. So that means each individual then of the species is now estranged is alienated, separated from every other individual as a free being, and now instead is represented as commodity being, as a thing that is just to grow its value in itself. No longer than it's just an end in itself, but a means. Now, if it is the worker who is not free, who is exploited, who is alienated, that does not have free labor, who then does the activity of free laboring belong to? And Marx's answer is that free laboring belongs to the capitalist, the bourgeoisie, who owns the means of production. That the bourgeoisie is the only class who is never divorced, even in an abstract way, from subsistence, because they own the means of subsistence, and therefore their subsistence is effectively guaranteed. Now this is where Marx tries to show private property is the cause of this alienation. And if you want true freedom, freedom that liberalism talked about, that John Locke and Rousseau and Kant talked about, Marx is trying to say, look, you can't have that until you abolish private property and property becomes communally owned. Now, there's a misconception coming out of Marx and communism and socialism more generally that there's this idea that, well, the solution is equality of like wages, that everyone gets paid the same amount of money, and that's supposed to solve things. That is actually a very big misconception, and one that Marx actually argues against, that wages, simply an increase in wages or equality of wages to compensate the worker is not a solution to this problem. So on page 80, Marx says, a forcing up of wages would therefore be nothing but better payment for the slave, and would not conquer either for the worker or for labor their human status and dignity. Indeed, even the equality of wages demanded by Proudhon, who was this socialist anarchist figure, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, famously said, property is theft, only transforms the relationship of the present-day worker to his labor into the relationship of all men to labor. Society is then conceived as an abstract capitalist. Wages are a direct consequence of estranged labor, and estranged labor is the direct cause of private property. The downfall of the one aspect must therefore mean the downfall of the other. That you cannot therefore overcome alienation of the worker, of labor, without therefore overcoming the problem of private property. So simply therefore an increase in wages doesn't change this relationship of alienation. What I would like to end with in the Paris manuscripts is maybe one of the more famous quotes of Marx here, where he says that the denial of life is the cardinal doctrine of capitalism. And in this way, he goes beyond simply trying to say that, well, capitalism exploits workers, but that capitalism denies living for the sake of living. And that's a really, I think, interesting argument here. So let's see. Okay, so this is the bottom of page 95. Marx says, thus political economy, and so, sorry, I should say, when he refers to political economy here, he means the bourgeois economists, i.e., the economists who would try to justify capitalism. Thus, political economy, despite its worldly and wanton appearance, is a true moral science, the most moral of all the sciences. Now, notice what he's saying here is basically he's saying capitalism is the most moral of all the sciences. What does he mean by that? That capitalism is the most moral of all the sciences. What he means by that is capitalism justifies itself by moralizing. That instead of treating problems like, take climate change, for example, as a problem of the basic structure of society, capitalism then says, Well, if you want to see this change come about, you should be making the change yourself. Why aren't you doing anything about it? When Marx would say, the problem is not that individuals aren't making this change, it's that the structure exists such that until that structure is changed, individuals decided to make this change on their own can't change the outcome of that system. So in this way, in moralizing then, capitalism obfuscates the nature of its existence. So he says, self-denial, the denial of life and of all human needs, is its cardinal doctrine. The less you eat, drink, and read books, the less you go to the theater, the dance hall, the public house, the less you think, love, theorize, sing, paint, fence, etc., the more you save, the greater becomes your treasure, which neither moths nor dust will devour, your capital. The less you are, the more you have. The less you express your own life, the greater is your alienated life. The greater is the store of your estranged being. Everything which the political economist takes from you in life and in humanity, he replaces for you in money and in wealth. And all the things which you cannot do, your money can do. It can eat and drink, go to the dance hall and the theater. It can travel. It can appropriate art, learning, the treasures of the past, political power. All this it can appropriate for you. It can buy all of this for you. It is the true endowment. Yet being all this, it is inclined to do nothing but create itself, to buy itself, for everything else is, after all, its servant. So what Marx is saying there is that while capitalism paints itself as being that economic system which makes possible greater enjoyment of life, Marx is saying what it really does is that's only secondary, but its primary focus is the growth of itself, that all things are to be sacrificed for the sake of maximization of profit. Okay. What I want to do now briefly before getting to the discussion question is go over, in the same way that I went over philosophical liberalism and libertarianism and conservatism, I want to go over communism, socialism, and anarchism. What is that, right? These terms get thrown around all the time. So communism is the ideological doctrine that argues society would function communally with the means of production being collectively owned, that there must be no class structure with the characteristic of an employer-employee dynamic. Now, socialism, so it's the end result, right? Where there is, no private or public entity determining what people must do in their lives, but because these things are shared mutually, they're able to choose for themselves what they want to do with their life. Socialism is the more transitionary politics with the goal of realizing communism. There are many different kinds of socialism then, right? So this is the means to the end, which is communism. First, there is what is called state socialism. This is the advocation of a political program which converts society to communism through the use of a vanguard, through where I'll briefly talk about next time with Mikhail Bakunin, where there's supposed to be these intellectual kind of elites that use the state to wrest private property from the capitalists through a revolution, and then democratize and collectivize property. Then there's democratic socialism. So this is an advocation of a political program which converts society to communism by working within the established political system. So it's not a revolution, like an overhaul, a seizing of the state. Instead, it's a working within the system to slowly, produce this reform. And then you have what's called libertarian socialism or anarchism, or sometimes anarcho-communism. This is the advocation of a political program which converts society to communism through anti-state means, so usually through the ground up. Now, of course, just seeing that definition of communism, you can go around and look at historical supposed examples like the Soviet Union and quickly realize Technically, the Soviet Union was not communist because they did not abolish that dynamic of the employee and the employer. That it simply became public, that you had state bureaucracy, which was the employer, dictating to the employees, the workers, what they had to produce and how much they got paid and so on. Marx thought communism, capitalism was necessary in this process, but again, that communism would inevitably come about. So these, in the Soviet Union, originally in China, although now China is not communist, it's actually the greatest capitalist success story. But the goal would be, of course, again, that you would not have that dynamic between the capitalists and the working class. So anytime someone says some country is communist, just quickly look, okay, did they abolish the dynamic between the employer and the employee? If they didn't, and remember the state, where the state tells the workers what to do, that also has not abolished it, it's just made it public instead of private. That is not communism, so just keep that in mind. But two more quick things. Oftentimes you might hear this term called social democracy. This is sometimes used hand in hand with democratic socialism. So someone like Bernie Sanders called himself a democratic socialist. Maybe he really is a democratic socialist and that ultimately he does think, communism is the best society. I don't know. But just based on his policies alone, they weren't democratic socialists. They were what is known as social democracy. And that is what you see in countries, in the Scandinavian countries like Denmark and Norway and so on, where there's greater welfare and there's some socially shared capital, but it still remains largely within a capitalist market-based paradigm. And then the last thing I want to say is that while communism is that end goal and socialism is supposed to be that transitionary politics, Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto and called himself a communist and not a socialist because there were a lot of movements that called themselves socialists, and Marx thought they were too much of a middle-class movement, that they didn't really connect with the working class. They were too much of the white-collar, like what you would call professional managerial class, and they didn't really have their roots in the real democratic working class itself. So just keep that in mind when you hear Marx call himself a communist, that technically he's a socialist, but sometimes communism and socialism can go hand in hand, but really communism is the end state and socialism is the means, the transition to that end state. So I just thought an interesting discussion question could be, do you agree that the working class is alienated and exploited? Do you buy any of those arguments that Marx gave about the alienation of the worker? Is any of that familiar? Do you experience that yourself in any way? And then, do you agree with Marx's conception of freedom, with that distinction between negative and positive liberty, and that you need positive liberty, not just negative liberty, to truly be free?